Hello, welcome to International Biorenewables Law and Policy. This presentation is part one of a three-part series on the economics of biotechnologies. We'll start this presentation by introducing what is the concept of a biotechnology, what are the types of products and purposes of which they're built, and we'll move on to talk about some of the relevant economic concepts that you need to understand an overview of the cost of producing biofuels and bioproducts. A biorefinery, in essence, is a facility that takes primarily biomass and converts it into fuels, chemicals, and bioproducts. In historical terms, this can be accomplished using biochemical or thermochemical processes, and we'll move on to talk about the definitions and differences between these two. The thermochemical approach employs heat and pressure to convert biomass into some of its constituents. This approach is very flexible. It can take all types of organic feedstocks. It's relatively fast. It takes place in a matter of seconds, but it suffers from typically high capital costs. The biochemical approach is not that different from the fermentation technology that we use to produce alcohol. It's typically a low temperature technology. It has a relatively slow conversion. It mainly converts sugar-rich feedstocks, and it typically has a low capital cost. However, because the feedstock has high content of sugar, which is a food component, the feedstock typically has a very high value. To give you an idea of what are the typical values for operating conditions between these technologies, you can see on the left, thermochemical conversion varies from as little as 200 degrees Celsius to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. It typically operates at over 10 bars of pressure, that's 10 atmospheres. It can operate at atmospheric conditions, but there are a lot of thermochemical processes that operate at high pressure. The residence time, or the time it takes to convert the biomass into some of the products, can take a few seconds, or it can last for over an hour. The capital cost, the cost it takes to build a facility, can be as much as 10 to 50% of the total capital cost. The biochemical approach, on the other hand, operates at about 25 degrees Celsius. A lot of the microbes that are utilized in the biochemical approach are not able to operate under high temperature conditions, and so we tend to keep the temperature relatively low or optimal for those microbes. The conversion, or the time it takes the microbes to digest the feedstock, can be hours to more than a week. The capital cost for a biochemical facility is usually relatively low, mostly because these are typically sterilized tanks that don't have to sustain high temperature and pressure conditions, and so they're inexpensive to build. However, as we mentioned earlier, the feedstock cost is relatively high quality food, and so it often contributes more than 40% of the cost of the final product. To give you an idea of the relative cost of the different technologies, here's a diagram showing or comparing the cost of several biochemical and thermochemical technologies. We have grain ethanol, which is the conventional fermentation process that dominates in the United States and around the world for biofuel production. We have cellulosic ethanol, which is an emerging technology for converting not just corn and sugarcane, but also lignocellulosic biomass, such as stover, corn stover, into biofuel. And then we have the traditional thermochemical technologies, which are biomass to methanol, biomass to hydrogen, and biomass to Fischer-Tropsch. Fischer-Tropsch is a type of green diesel technology. You can use it to produce gasoline and diesel type fuels from biomass, although commercially it's mostly used to convert natural gas into transportation fuels. What you see in this chart is a comparison of the operating costs of the 5 different technologies based on the capital, biomass, operation and management, and credits. What you can observe on the grain ethanol technology, even though the cost is relatively comparable to the other technologies, the major component of that cost is feedstock cost. Now, this high feedstock cost was at a time when corn was selling between $4 and $6 a bushel. So you can see how the feedstock cost can be a major component of that technology. Capital, however, is fairly small. Now, another advantage of the biochemical approach is that it often produces high-value food-type byproducts. In the case of grain ethanol, we produce dry distillers' dried grain. These grains are still edible by animals, and so they're often sold as animal feed, which is a high-value market. In that case, the co-product credit for grain ethanol is significant. In the case of the thermochemical technologies, as you can see, the capital cost is a major component, contributing oftentimes up to a third of the cost in this graph. The biomass cost that we assumed in this analysis was over $50 a ton, and so in that case, feedstock cost is still the majority of the cost, but you can certainly appreciate in a Fischer-Tropsch scenario that if you can find lower cost feedstock, capital cost could be the major component. These costs that you see here are on a dollar per gallon of gasoline equivalent. These costs are relevant to 2007. Certainly, what we found in recent years is that the cost of biofuels can be much higher than what we have here, and we'll discuss this in future slides. In order to understand why biofuels are expensive, we need to understand the structure of biomass. Biomass generally has three components: lignin, hemicellulose, and cellulose. Cellulose is the primary energy storage of biomass. As you can see on the bottom left, it's composed mostly of sugar molecules, glucose components, that are tied together into long strings. The plant uses this for energy. However, microbes can use it for energy as well. And that's the case of biochemical fermentation in the corn ethanol technology. Now, in order to protect the cellulose, plants have developed two different structures. The first one is hemicellulose, which are shown on the left as the blue bindings around the cellulose structures. The hemicellulose is a relatively amorphous type of material. It is also composed of mostly sugar molecules, but the order is not as structured as in the case of cellulose. And so it often has two different types of sugars in its structure. Around all this material, there's usually, for lignocellulosic biomass, another type of material called lignin. Lignin is what provides the plant structure, is what helps it stand up straight. And it's shown here on the left as the red strands that look like columns or rows holding, going through the plant cell wall. This lignin not only provides the plant structure, but is also designed to keep bugs away from the cellulose. And so historically, bugs have not been able to be very efficient at destroying or depolymerizing the lignin. And you can see the structure shown here. Because lignin is such a complicated structure, it's difficult to engineer a bug that could effectively convert all the different components in the lignin. For this reason, the biochemical approach oftentimes discards the lignin as a byproduct. With a thermochemical approach, we're able to convert all the different components in the biomass resource. This is important because a majority of the biomass that's available out there contains lignin, or is lignocellulosic biomass. What we see in this slide is an estimate of how much biomass is available if you could buy it at $60 per dry ton in the United States. This analysis was done by the Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they estimate that the United States could sustainably convert over 1 billion tons of biomass into biofuels and bioproducts. A significant portion of that biomass is forest land resources, and we're anticipating that energy crops will become a growing part of the portfolio of biomass available in the United States by 2030, for example. And so these types of biomass oftentimes have a high amount of lignin. Now, in order to incentivize the production of biofuels, which is fairly expensive and difficult to compete with conventional fuels, the United States has developed policy drivers. These are mandates, volume mandates, for the adoption of biofuels into the existing transportation fuel mix. Since 2007, the United States anticipated the production of renewable biofuel, primarily corn grain ethanol and sugarcane ethanol from Brazil, to grow to over 14 billion gallons per year. And the United States has been fairly successful in meeting this target. For many years, we've been able to not only meet, but exceed the mandate of renewable biofuel production. However, in addition to the renewable biofuel production, the Renewable Fuel Standard anticipated that by 2015, we will start producing growing amounts of cellulosic biofuels. This is biofuel derived from the lignocellulosic biomass. There's an additional category of undifferentiated advanced biofuel. This category is for biofuels that meet a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. However, as we'll see in the following slides, the United States has been unable to meet many of these targets. In terms of commercializing advanced biofuels, we can see that the corn ethanol industry has been able to, again, meet and exceed the mandates. However, as you see on the top right, cellulosic ethanol has lagged far behind the mandates for the cellulosic biofuel use in the United States. At the bottom of this slide, you can see the different technologies and categories that have been actually implemented as of 2010. You have the biochemical technologies for advanced biofuels. About 11 plants were either in a pilot demonstration or commercial scale. There are other products you can produce with the biochemical approach, notably biobutanol, and there were 2 plants that was scheduled to start operation in 2010. The thermochemical approach, remember this is the expensive technology, only had at that time 5 technologies moving forward. You can have hybrid hybrid biochemical and thermochemical technologies, and 2 facilities were being built in 2010. While there were many projects being in different levels of commercialization, the amount of biofuel that were actually produced and sold to consumers was relatively small. To give you an idea, you can look at an article by Tristan Brown and Robert Brown, published in 2013, which compared the productions and cost of the various commercialization technologies for biofuel production. Many of these facilities are still struggling to operate at full capacity. And so this is a challenge for the biofuel industry, but it's not that different from any emerging industry. And so we're still struggling to develop commercialized biofuel technologies. And hopefully this series of presentations will help you appreciate what are the challenges of commercializing biofuel. To summarize, biotechnology platforms can use a variety of strategies to convert biomass, lignocellulosic and biomass, into fuels, chemicals, and products. Although the industry has widely adopted a biochemical platform, there is potential for the thermochemical platform to see wider adoption. Between these 2 different platforms, we can achieve a high feedstock flexibility and try to meet some of the policy drivers that are incentivizing the development of advanced biofuels.